Alright, welcome back to Random Star Trek, the series where I use a Star Trek randomizer online. Hopefully I remember to put the link to it in the description this time before the video goes up, to pick a random episode each video out of the Star Trek series that are currently on American Netflix, watch back through the episode for the 1000th time, and then make a video about it. Today we're finally talking about an episode of what I think is the best Star Trek series, Star Trek Deep Space Nine. And even if it's not the best, and you could argue that it's not, it's certainly my favorite. In fact, I'm going to level with you guys, I did not need to rewatch this episode before making this video, which really helped expedite things, frankly. I have seen this episode so many times and I know so much trivia about it that I had to do literally no research at all in order to put this video together. And I will say right out the gate, if you are on the fence about whether or not to watch Star Trek in its entirety or even just Deep Space Nine, let's say you're a fan of Star Trek already or Star Trek as a concept, but you're not sure you're going to watch this particular series, this is one of the best episodes of Star Trek ever made. And if you think you have an inkling that you might watch it someday, maybe don't watch this video. I don't want to spoil this episode for you. Maybe mute it and let it play in the background so I can get watch time on it. But skip this one for now. It's okay if you do. I won't hold it against you. That said, the trailer for this one that we watched at the end of the last random Star Trek episode, a review of the episode of Voyager, Faces, isn't entirely accurate about the premise of this one, but I don't blame it. It's not trying to make things seem arbitrarily sexier or something. Like literally every single trailer for every single episode of Star Trek Enterprise did, even though it didn't need to. Enterprise was already sex-charged enough. It's just that this one is a hard one to summarize the premise of. It's a very complex episode with a lot of complex themes. I just realized as I started going down my checklist of notes that I can't be vague with this one, can I? I can't be vague about the premise of Deep Space Nine, can I? Because every time I talk about a different Star Trek for the first time, I go over what it's about. That's just an aspect of this series, isn't it? Okay, so, bare bones, Deep Space Nine is Babylon 5, but Star Trek. Now, that's a bad old joke. That's kind of true, though, I guess. If you've seen Babylon 5, that's kind of what Deep Space Nine is. And there's a few accusations that maybe the premise of this was stolen from the premise of Babylon 5, but they've never been substantiated. And pretty much everything else is different, right? So it's fine. It's okay. We're not going to get into it. Unlike other Star Treks, though, this isn't about a ship exploring space, visiting aliens of the week and planets of the week. It's about a crew of a space station, which isn't even technically a Starfleet or Federation space station. It belongs to the planet Bajor, and therefore it's an open port with, like, civilian businesses and stuff on it. And Starfleet has to obey Bajoran laws and customs. The commander and later captain of this show, Benjamin Sisko, is technically in charge. In most situations, he has final say, but his first officer is a Bajoran officer who is able to exert political pressure in order to actually influence what's going on the station most of the time. And because she is the representative for the government that owns the station that he's just here to manage, she clashes with him a lot more than the executive officers of a lot of the other captains. She's allowed to be more antagonistic. In fact, the characters are allowed to be more antagonistic with each other in this show than they tend to be allowed to be in Star Trek in general, because that's part of the premise of this show. These people do not always see eye to eye because they have different motivations. They're not a homogenous group all working towards exploring space for the greater good of humanity. And while the show has all of its Star Trek staples, you have the commander and later captain who is, while not as straight-laced as some of the past ones, he's a little more Kirkish than he is, like, Picardish, really. Is still your good guy Starfleet officer. You have your Starfleet doctor, you have a science officer, who's heavily queer-coded, by the way, So if that's something you're looking for in your sci-fi, this is an okay place to get it. Then you have the aforementioned executive officer, Kieran Nerys, who is just such a badass. You have Miles O'Brien, who, while he's a Starfleet officer, is a non-commissioned officer, which is something we don't see explored much. It's a concept we don't see explored much in Star Trek. His dynamic with the people around him is really unique, because technically he doesn't hold a rank, and yet he's still in charge of his own department. There's the head of security, Odo, who is a completely unknown kind of alien, even to himself. He doesn't even know what he is. And then there's characters like Quark, the local bartender, who's also just, he's a scoundrel. He's a criminal. And yet, still a good person, for the most part. This is a diverse group of characters with different wants and ways of getting things done. And they find themselves in all these politically charged situations. And the cast doesn't even stop there. This show has a huge supporting cast. One supporting cast member in particular, being a heavily gay-coded ex-spy who is, hands down, probably the best character in the entire show, if not the entire franchise. His name's Garrick, and I love this guy. I usually don't like villainy protagonists, but I love this guy. He's fantastic.
As you may also know, I have a clothing shop nearby, so if you should require any apparel or simply wish, as I do, for a bit of enjoyable company now and then, I'm at your disposal, Doctor. I'm so glad to have made such an interesting new friend today.
And eventually, if you're a fan of Next Generation, this show brings in Worf from that show, and he becomes a series regular. It's very good. It's diverse in an in-universe kind of way, and also in a real-world kind of way. This is the first show with a black commanding officer, for example. And a character I haven't mentioned up to this point, his son, Jake, comes along for the ride, and they have a fantastic father-son dynamic. In fact, one of the things that Avery Brooks, the actor who played Sisko, was most concerned about with the portrayal of this character is he wanted to portray a strong, loving relationship between a black man and his son, because that's something you didn't see much on TV at the time. And in fact, this is one of my favorite bits of trivia about the show, Brooks basically adopted the actor who played his son, Cyril Lofton, into his family. They still treat each other like family to this day. In many ways, Deep Space Nine is an actionized sequel relative to the original series of The Next Generation. It's a more action-oriented show, and yet oftentimes it ends up being the most cerebral of all of them. What eventually ends up being the main arc of the show, because this is an at least mostly serialized show, what ends up being the main arc of the show is a war with an organization from the other side of the galaxy, an organization which is the Federation, but all of the negative aspects are emphasized rather than the positive ones. And despite the fact that this leads to several big, epic space battles with expensive movie-style special effects, the war itself is never used exclusively for eye candy. Like, it's really cool to see Galaxy-class ships of the same class as the Enterprise from Next Generation, really showing how powerful they can be in combat, because we didn't see a lot of combat in Next Gen. That's cool. It's undeniably cool as a Star Trek fan, but the war primarily exists here for much the same reason that the Prime Directive existed in the original series. It is here to test the humanity of the characters by pitting them against their worst natures. The primary plot device of the show, though, is the Bajoran wormhole, the means by which the Federation and the Dominion are able to interact in the first place. It's a stable wormhole, the only one to exist in Star Trek canon, created by a race of timeless, ageless, godlike beings known to the Bajorans as the Prophets. It connects the main setting of the show, the Alpha Quadrant, with the Gamma Quadrant, where the Dominion are located. And a major recurring plot point in the show is that, one, people want control of this wormhole because it's a major economic utility. But two, whenever they need something funky to happen, The wormhole is right there. The station orbits the wormhole, so they can just have the wormhole do something funky to make plot happen. And technically speaking, this episode, which I have said may be the best episode of Star Trek ever, and is an outstanding episode of science fiction just in general, is driven by that. The plot of this one is set in motion by one of this show's most recurring cliches. The wormhole is about to undergo some weird quantum space hiccup or something. It doesn't really matter. None of the science in this show is real anyway. And so the characters take their support craft, the USS Defiant, to go and look at it. In the midst of this, something goes wrong and Ben is struck by a bolt of space lightning, trapping him in an alternate dimension outside of time. Like, at first we think he's dead, we think he's been vaporized, but he's just stuck in another dimension outside of time. You know, that old cliche. And it sounds super silly, and on paper it is. What you have to understand is that while Star Trek tries to portray real science whenever it can, for the most part, the science in this show, the technobabble, as it is referred to colloquially by fans, in this show is primarily an excuse to get the plot going. And so what this episode ends up actually being about is what Jake Sisko's life would be like without his father. Because what you have to understand about Jake is that even though Sirik has been here since the very beginning, he has his name in the titles, he started out primarily as an accoutrement to Ben's character. He was here to be something stable in Ben's life, as well as a gauge by which we, the audience, could measure Ben's character growth. Which is not to say he's an afterthought by any stretch. He definitely has character. He is a character. They wouldn't have put his name in the titles if he wasn't. But most of what Jake Sisko is dependent upon his father, the relationship he has in universe with the father character. So already just the idea of removing that character from the equation is interesting. Like, it's something they can only do for a single episode, obviously, because Ben is the protagonist of the show. Like, it's an ensemble, but he's definitely the protagonist of the show. So you know by the end this is all going to be reset, but that doesn't matter. It's a hook, and it's a good one. But before I get too ahead of myself, the episode actually opens with a different hook. One that is arguably even more intriguing, and I think the reason they did this is because overall, this is a really good gateway episode to get somebody into Deep Space Nine. And I'll talk about this a little as we go, but basically the technobabbly hook is a hook for recurring Deep Space Nine watchers. The other hook, though, where a young woman comes to a cabin in the woods and finds an elderly Jake Sisko living as a recluse, is meant to be a hook for anybody. Like, even if you don't know who Jake Sisko is, the idea of an old man living in the middle of the woods being sought out by a young woman who's played by the daughter of the actor who plays Garrick, like, that literally doesn't matter to anything, I just think it's a fun fact. The idea of someone showing up in a situation like this, the idea of this interaction, is interesting, and the dialogue they exchange in their initial encounter is interesting, inherently so. And so that ends up being the framing device for the whole episode. We flash back as elderly Jake Sisko, played by a wonderful character actor, Tony Todd, tells this woman the story of how he ended up where he is. Because one of the recurring things about Jake is he wants to be a writer. And so this young woman's reason for being here is she also wants to be a writer, and she just recently discovered the only two things he ever published. A single novel, which we do see him writing later in the show, it's really cool, and a published collection of short stories. And she was so inspired by his writing that when she found out that that's all there was, that he for some reason gave up writing just as his name was starting to get out there, she was inspired to seek him out wherever he was and learn what happened. A situation based on a real-life event that I'm not going to talk about here because it wasn't as fun or as innocent as the event in this episode. And the interactions between these two characters throughout the entire episode are great. Both of these characters are played masterfully, and they just have this immediate rapport. Old Jake immediately starts behaving like a mentor to this young person who aspires to be the thing that he once aspired to be, which fits right in with the themes of the episode. This episode is all about how you shouldn't let loss and grief and obsession keep you from living your life. And old Jake's goal in this episode is to make up for wasting his own life. And one of the ways he can do that is by passing down his wisdom to someone with the same dream that he had. But yeah, the episode sets all that up. Then we see the stuff with Sisko and him seemingly dying. But as the story progresses, we learn that that's not what happened. We learn about the extra-dimensional thing. He doesn't experience the passage of time there, so he doesn't age as this story progresses. But he does jump back into the story occasionally, only when Jake is around. And at least at first, there's no evidence that it's actually happening. So there's that little bit of mystery there. Is Jake actually experiencing this? Or is his grief just getting the best of him? But eventually we learn that Ben is tethered to Jake. That something about the means by which Ben was zapped to another dimension, the space lightning thing, which also hit Jake a little bit, has tethered them together. He's tied to Jake's physical existence. And so occasionally, as the wormhole does weird space stuff, Ben will snap back to Jake for a short period of time before being snatched back into that timeless space. And as time passes, this stops happening so often. And so, at his father's behest, because Ben, of course, insists that Jake move on with his life, even if there is the chance that he might see his father again in one of these brief episodes, he still needs to move on with his life. And he does. He gets married, he becomes a writer, but then they start happening again. Just as he is starting to make the name for himself that he always wanted to, just as he is starting to achieve his dreams, it happens again. And he becomes obsessed with getting Ben back. He gives up writing and even drives his wife away, going back to school so that he can learn all of the technobabble necessary to figure out what exactly is going on with Ben and figure out how to stop it. And he thinks he does. He gets to a point where he understands this phenomenon better than anyone else alive, and he thinks he can fix this. But he needs to go and do science stuff to the wormhole the next time it has one of those big cosmic burps. So 50 years after Sisko disappeared, he returns to the wormhole, does a bunch of science at it, and fails. And he has been living his life ever since then, under the weight of everything that he lost, trying to achieve this new goal, coupled with the knowledge that he failed at it. And now, here is this young woman who shows up the day before his last chance to fix everything. Because as it turns out, he was a little bit wrong about what was going on. But the stuff that he was wrong about actually gives him a chance to fix things. Because he's learned that if he dies at one of the moments that Ben is there with him, Ben will return to the moment where he was originally removed from time. Which won't necessarily guarantee that he won't be zapped out of time again, but he'll at least have a chance to do things differently. And straight up, this doesn't make much sense, because they already established that Ben is tethered to Jake's physical existence, and dying would not suddenly erase his physical self from existence, even vaporizing him. Like the particles that make up his body would still be there. But it doesn't matter, because the way this episode ends is with this old man whose life has been ruined by his obsession, sacrificing himself to give his younger self and his father a second chance at life. And clearly you're not going to see any one-to-one analogs to this in real life. This is an inherently sci-fi or fantasy-esque kind of thing, but it works as symbolism for giving up your obsessions and starting over. In fact, we see that old Jake started to do this in the more traditional sense. He's started writing again in the time that he had left. And as he bids that young woman farewell, as he prepares to make that sacrifice, he even gives her one of his unfinished manuscripts, one that he made a bunch of notes in the margins of, so that she can learn from his example. And I think my absolute favorite aspect of this entire episode, like all that's really good, it's really strong stuff, but I think my absolute favorite aspect of this episode is that when Ben does show up and Jake explains to him what he has to do to put everything right, Ben still doesn't want him to do it. That's still his son, and he would never ask his son to die for him. Even the fact that it would reset things and give them a chance to be together longer still doesn't make it any better. It's not like this is a heroic sacrifice. It's still a tragedy, because at the end of the day, he still wasted his life. It's still a tragedy. Just like in a real-world situation, losing that much of your life to an obsession like this is still a tragedy, even if in the end you manage to make something better out of your situation. And you can see, even in the end, once Ben returns to that moment and manages to save himself and Jake from harm, even though he's glad to be back with his son, he's glad to have this second chance, he still mourns that man that he lost. Like, I reiterate again, this was not a heroic sacrifice. In the end, it leaves you thinking, is this a good thing? Or is it a tragic thing? Or is it both? There's no easy answer. And on top of this, because Deep Space Nine is a serialized show, and because I've seen the rest of the show, and I know what happens in the technically altered history of the story, because you could argue that the stuff that happened with old Jake is the correct history of the Star Trek universe, that Jake changed it. But because of all that, because I know what happens in the rest of the show, there's tons of lore stuff here. It's so good. Like I mentioned, that enemy that they go to war with, the Dominion, there's no Dominion war in the future of old Jake, which at first makes it seem like Sisko being removed from history was a good thing, since it prevented all of the deaths that war caused. But then you remember that the Dominion are led by characters who are effectively immortal. They aren't entirely timeless like the aliens from the wormhole, but they don't think of time the same way that we do. In fact, they don't think of anything the same way that we do. That's what makes them so dangerous an enemy. And so what you realize is that the war is still going to happen. It's just that Sisko's presence in some way or another, and I have some theories as to how, forced their hand and caused them to engage with the Federation directly before they were ready. Which means that Sisko being returned to the timeline, even though it caused some net negatives in the short term, might have saved the entire Alpha Quadrant in the long term, and yet, I still would not say that old Jake sacrificing himself was a heroic sacrifice. It was still a tragedy, but you might think differently, because technically that sacrifice did save the Alpha Quadrant. I love this episode. I love this episode a lot. In fact, there's only one thing I'd change about this one if I had the opportunity. Originally, they were going to have Cirroc Lofton play old Jake as well, but they just didn't like how the old man makeup was turning out on him. They didn't want him in it for most of the episode. And that bums me out so much, because, no offense to Cirroc Lofton, of course, I think he's great. Tony Todd is probably technically a better actor. Man, I really like Cirroc's version of Jake, and whether he's not technically as good an actor or not, he's still great. And he's able to build such a strong rapport with whatever other actors are in front of the camera with him at a given time. And so I desperately want to see that version of the episode where he played Jake throughout the entire thing. I don't know for sure that it would be better. I don't know for sure that that would be the only thing that would change in that version if that version had been made, but I have a very selfish desire to somehow see it. Take me to that alternate dimension, please. Also, technically, there's yet another potential alternate version of this episode. There's some scenes with some members of the Deep Space Nine crew set far in the future at that 50 years in the future mark when they return to the wormhole. And Colm Meaney, who plays Chief O'Brien, was supposed to be there. There was supposed to be some additional scenes with him, and he wasn't available to shoot. And I kind of wish he had been. I would have liked to have seen a crotchety elderly O'Brien. But still, as this episode exists, it's basically perfect. This is basically a perfect hour of television. And I don't just mean that in the sense that it's a perfect Star Trek episode. I mean that the experience of watching this is peak. It's that good. Like, I genuinely believe that you can enjoy this episode without being a Star Trek fan. Being a Star Trek fan just makes it that much better. If you are somehow a fan of this franchise and missed out on this one, I don't know if I'll ever mean this as strongly as I do right now. You don't know what you're missing. Go watch the episode. In the meantime, though, we have plenty of other Star Trek episodes that I need to talk about, so let's go ahead and fire up the old Star Trek randomizer and see which episode we're going to be talking about next time. And click.
Are you responsible for bringing us here?
She's a mute, Jim. No vocal cords.
She must be an empath.
Do not interfere. Jim, what happened to them? You are on schedule. Some further simple tests are necessary. You will decide which of your men we shall use. He's dying, Jim.
One specimen will be sufficient. You will come with us.
Please tell me what I'm dying for.
Huh. That could be interesting. In the meantime, though, as per usual, I'd like to know, what do you think of this episode of Star Trek Deep Space Nine, The Visitor, if you have seen it? Let's get a discussion going in the comment section down below. And while you're down there, you might as well like the video, share it with anyone else you think might enjoy my content, subscribe if you haven't. You can also check out my social medias, links to those will be in the video description. But either way, this has been AJ22, and I will talk to you guys later.